here, northeast Texas, northwest Louisiana, and southwest Arkansas. And the ancestors of the modern-day Caddo are known for being the best potters in the southeast. So the pots that you see shown here are examples of the pottery that are typically found on these Caddo sites. As you can see, it's very well made, it's very thin, very elaborately decorated. One of the things about these pots is they're frequently found whole in burials. So that has made them attractive for centuries to people who want to loot sites. Because they can essentially dig. Usually most burials of one individual will have 5 or 6 pots with them. Get 5 or 6 pots and kind of sell them on the market. So that's a problem that we deal with pretty frequently in southeast Oklahoma, is that these sites are typically heavily looted. One of the other things is, if you know anything about southeast Oklahoma, sort of the McCurtain County area where I'm going to be working, these sort of artifact looting is kind of tied into the drug trade, so we've got a kind of weird situation working down there because sometimes it can get a little dangerous. So when I'm talking about Caddoan, you can see the whole map here of the southeastern U.S. is divided up into these various brands of Mississippian culture. Mississippian culture lasted from about 81,000 to 1,500. You had it's sort of centered here at the Cahokia site, which is sort of the biggest prehistoric site in ancient North America, right outside of East St. Louis, Illinois, East St. Louis, Illinois, right here at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. And actually the other 2 largest sites in North America are actually the East St. Louis Mound Group and a mound site that's under pretty much downtown St. Louis took that mound site out. So this is sort of the center of Mississippian culture. And Mississippian culture basically is defined by a series of different traits. So Mississippians grew maize, so that's their main subsistence base. They grew corn. They made pottery that is tempered with crushed mussel shell. So when you make a pot, you have to add something to the clay. You can't just go dig up clay and make your pot and have it survive. You have to add something to it. So the prehistoric Mississippians, sort of their signature is they added shell to it. And shell makes it a little bit less likely to break, and it makes it a little bit more heat resistant. The other thing that sort of marks Mississippian culture is it's for the first time in the prehistory of the Southeast that we have political consolidation. So we have chiefs who live at Cahokia who are actually exerting political power over a lot of surrounding sites. And what happens is Mississippian culture arises in this area around 1050 AD, and then spreads to a lot of the southeast. So, we get Mississippian culture here. Cahokia is the center of a big, what we call a chiefdom, which essentially means that there's the chiefs living at the site of Cahokia control a whole series of people living around this area that we call the American Bottom region. And so their ideas of sort of political consolidation spread across the southeast and spread first down here into this sort of Kentucky, Tennessee area, all the way into West Alabama. And then sort of places on the fringes, Caddo, Plaquemine, South Appalachian, sort of selectively adopt some of these traits. So what we get is we have these sites where we have chiefs that are sort of exerting political control over various areas for using that idea from Cahokia, but they're not adopting all of the sort of material culture that Cahokia. They're not adopting all the artifacts. They're not adopting all of the sort of ideas that are coming out of Cahokia. So that is sort of why we put these Caddo sites in southeast Oklahoma out on the edge of this Caddo Mississippian group. So I'm talking about sites that date from 1000 to 1500. And so we have a whole series of these sites. This is just a few of them. There are actually several hundred recorded sites occupied by Caddo people in southeast Oklahoma. You can see there's sort of 4 different river drainages here that come out of the southern Washita Mountains, Kiamichi, the Glover, Little River, and the Mountain Fork. And there's Caddo people who live all along these, and then there's a prehistoric Caddo people who live along the Red River as well. The 2 sites I'm going to be talking about tonight are Clement Site, which is here, and then on the Glover drainage, it's actually over here, but they had to fit the dots in. So it's actually right over here. And then the Grove and Davis site, which is on the Little River. And they're only about 6 kilometers apart, so they're not very far apart. But the interesting thing is they don't, they seem to be sort of from two different chiefdoms. So there's like two, they're the sort of ritual center for two separate political bodies of sites. And then sort of the biggest Caddo sites tend to be here along the Red River. The reason why that is because the Red River is on a physiographic zone that we call the coastal plain. The good thing about the coastal plain is you get a lot of wide, flat land with nice sandy soil that makes it very easy for you to grow maize. And so there's a lot more space for people to spread out here. There's a lot more land where they can grow maize, whereas up in the sort of Piedmont mountain regions, there's not as much space. You know, you get much off the river and you're pretty much up in the hills. So people are sort of confined to really living along those drainages and sort of having to live in selective spots where there's, you know, enough soil around that they can actually grow crops in. So this is a map of the Clement Site, which is the first one I want to talk about. This is a site where we excavated in 2008. So the Glover drainage comes down here and takes a big bend, and then it makes there's an island here that is actually now cut off by a channel. And Clement, the part of Clement that we looked at is here. When it was originally found, there were actually two other parts of the Clement site. We're pretty sure one part of the site is here, and then there's more of the site somewhere out in here, but we can't find it yet because the landowners won't let us out there. So we don't know exactly where the whole site is. But the part that I'm talking about is the area that's outlined in red. And one of the things that you can see is that we've got, you know, I'm looking at almost a mile of territory here, and there's just this, and all of these are just sites where there's material from prehistoric Caddo people living. So they're living in a very sort of spread out environment. They're not living, a lot of Mississippian sites in the east, they build a palisade wall around the town and everybody builds their houses inside the wall. The Caddo never did this. They don't worry about defending themselves because apparently they don't have a big threat of being raided by outsiders. Whereas, you know, farther east there's a lot of conflict. So the Caddo can just live in these sort of very spread out settlements and they don't have to worry about defending themselves from external attack. This map is sort of a famous map. It's known as the Turan map. It was done in 1692. It is a Caddo settlement that's located along the Red River. There's a Spanish expedition to go to these villages, and so we have this sort of this 1692 map that looks very similar to the way that the sites are spread out along the Glover drainage that I just showed you. So this is it kind of translated into sort of a bit more clear transcription of the map. So what we have here is we have a series of these little house compounds. So we have, you know, two houses here. There's what we call a storage platform. I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. And a drying rack, and that's sort of like a family compound. And then, you know, this compound has like maybe one, and it's got a storage rack, and then we've got another family compound here. And then sort of around these houses are the fields where people are growing their corn. So this is how Caddo lived in 1691. It's how they lived in 1300, what we're looking at with the Clement site. This is a sort of long-standing settlement pattern for them. You notice here in the lower right, we've got the Temple Mound. What's interesting about this is, you know, on your normal Mississippian sites in the east, the mound is kind of at the very center of everything, and the chief lives there, and you know, he sort of controls everything from there. Caddo sites are a little bit different from their normal Mississippian sites because this is actually the chief's house here, and he's living here, and the mound is set away. It's set on the edge of the settlement. So the mound isn't at the center of everything. And the Caddo also historically differentiated. There were two different offices. There was the chief, who was the chief of the living. You know, he was the one who oversaw day-to-day political relations, sort of squabbles between people in the village. And then there's the priest, or the Shenanesi, and he sort of took care of that mound. He took care of all the relationships between the supernatural. So he was the guy who mediated between the Caddo and the religious world. And so what we see is there's sort of unlike the Mississippian world where all the chiefs are pretty much sort of, they're chiefs because of their role in religion, the Caddo differentiates between those two. So the religious and the sort of political life is a little bit more separate for the Caddo. And that's why that settlement is structured in that way. Now this is a really cool photograph because this is taken in 1870. The Caddo, of course, were sometime around 1500 abandoned southeast Oklahoma. They moved downstream to the Great Bend of the Red River to get closer to European traders by 1600, and then eventually moved into Texas, and then were later removed to the Binger, Oklahoma area in the early 19th century. This is taken by George Sewell, who's a photographer from the Smithsonian, who came through in 1870 and took this photo. And what I've always found fascinating about this photo is that these structures look exactly like what's depicted on that 1692 Turan map. So we've got, here's one of these sort of storage arbors. Chief Longhat, who's here, and his family are sitting on one of those same drying racks that we see on the Turan map. And then we have a whole series of these houses that look, very similar to the ones that the Spanish depicted on that map. So that's really cool. The Caddo clearly, clearly matches up very well with what we see from the prehistoric record. And another thing I'm going to point out here, because this will be important in the future, is that we have sort of two types of houses they're building here. So we've got this house, you see this one's kind of dome-shaped and it's more round. And then these houses here have the hipped roof and they are square in shape. And so we see those prehistorically as well, and I'll show you what those look like in the archaeological record. So the first excavations of the Clement Mound weren't actually done by us. In 1941, during the Great Depression in Oklahoma, we have a lot of people who are unemployed, so the Works Progress Administration employed a lot of archaeologists to work on archaeological sites all over the state of Oklahoma. They did a lot of work at the Spiro site, which is probably the most famous archaeological site in Oklahoma, located almost to Arkansas, right on the Arkansas River. And sort of at the very end of this whole WPA program, so 1941, right before the U.S. entered World War II, this whole crew of workers came and attacked the Clement Site. So you can see that there's a whole line of people here. They worked at the Clement Site for about 3 months. They work. Their sort of standards for working a little bit different than our sort of modern archaeology, so they move a lot of dirt compared to what we move nowadays. And they're actually starting to dig up into a mound at the Clement Site. And all of these white posts that you see here in the background are actually their grid. So of course when we dig a site, we basically make a grid over the whole site, and that controls where all the stuff that we excavate comes from. So what these guys are doing is they're basically digging. What they would do is you come upon a big mound of earth built by the Caddo, you just cut in a cross-section of it. So that's what they're doing, is they're just cutting into the side of this mound. There were 2 earthen mounds at the Clement Site, built, of course, by the prehistoric Caddo. They dug one completely out, and the other one they left in place. So this is what it looks like sort of after they've gone through and dug sort of partway into this mound. You can see the rows of stakes here. So I think there's an animation on here, let's see. So the way that this mound was built, okay, so the way that this mound was built is this mound was built in 3 layers, and you can sort of see this in the profile. So we've got this bottom level here that's what we call midden debris. So it's just everyday domestic garbage that people are living on that surface before the mound is ever built, and you get this black soil that's full of artifacts, it's full of stone, it's full of just organic material, so you get this almost greasy black soil. Then they built a really thin layer, just one sort of thin layer of earth, made it into sort of a truncated pyramid shape, so a flat top and diagonal sides, and then built a house on top of that. So once that house was burnt and they covered it with this really big layer of earth. So the mound was at least 2 meters high, maybe more. The Caddo built small mounds compared to everywhere else, so 2 meters, we're talking 7 feet. A lot of the biggest mounds in the U.S. Are well over 80 feet. So this is the Caddo don't build mounds that are as large typically as you see in the east. So they added this final stage in the mound, which was pretty thick. We're talking like 1.5 meters of mound fill. And then what you see here is they dug what we call a shaft tomb. And this is common on Caddo sites in the sort of Red River drainage, where they'll build a mound and then immediately dig down through the base of it and bury people on the base of it. So there's 8 people buried in the bottom of the shaft tomb. So that's why they dug this out, is because the WPA workers have dug into it and actually encountered these burials with eight people. We don't have any pictures of it. Unfortunately, also there's not great bone preservation in this area, so we have the remains in the Sam Noble Museum, but of course we're not going to study them, and unfortunately we don't know who actually those people were that were buried in that shaft tomb. Clearly there's somebody who's important prehistorically to have all this elaborate ceremony surrounding them being buried. So this is just another sort of typical profile at the edge of the mound. Now the other thing that we have is, the other thing the WPA excavated is they excavated a series of overlapping houses that were located sort of off the mound. So what we see here is actually just post hole patterns, and this is posts that would have formed the walls of the house. These two lines here, and this photograph is from the 40s, so it's not great, are the actual, what we call entrance trenches. And then this is actually another house that intersects it. So we have this house that's earlier, and then it's dismantled or burned in some way. And we have reason to believe that it was actually dismantled on purpose, because we have this big piece of clay that's placed at the entryway. And essentially what happens is, when these houses are no longer used, the Caddo would actually take them apart and put this plug of clay here that symbolizes we're done with this house. We've closed the entryway completely, and then they built this second house here. And so this is what it looks like excavated. I'll show you a plan map of it. That's the second structure, and you can see it's got a really long entrance trench. And actually, somehow one of the posts preserved, which is strange because the soil is so acidic. So it's probably red cedar, because that's the only thing that preserves in this kind of conditions. So this is what the houses actually would have looked like. Prehistorically, this one would have been a square house about 18 feet on the side. I think this one is like 15 by 13, I'm pretty sure. And this is going to be later. We know that earlier in time, probably 1150 or so, they built these 4-post structures. This one is going to be later. It's going to be probably as late as AD 1300, somewhere around there. And we've got these very long entrance trenches here. So to get into this house, you had to go down this would have been a sort of covered over trench to get in, and you have to go all the way down this thing. And there's also these two exterior posts, and there might have been some kind of screen set up there. We're pretty sure these houses are not just your everyday dwelling where somebody lives, but they have an actual special purpose. And there are a few other sites that were excavated, or there are a few other houses that were excavated. Unfortunately, all we have from those is we have this map of one of them, and then we have some arrows here pointing that there's another house this way and another house this way. But that's all we know about those from 1941. We know that this is probably, like the houses I was showing you before, those are special purpose houses. They're where important people would have lived. They would have conducted ceremonies there. These are just sort of your everyday domestic houses. We've got sort of a square pattern here. This is probably a hearth in the middle of it, so a fire pit here full of burned clay and wattle. We have the support post, and then after these houses were abandoned at some point, there actually became a cemetery. So we've got a bunch of intrusive burials placed into these. So these may actually be earlier than a lot of the occupation at the Clement Site, because we can see that they stood for a while, they were gone, and they used it as a cemetery. So when we're looking at the WPA excavations at the site, we've got sort of we know we have the big mound here that they excavated, the shaft tomb here in the center, and then these two houses are located fairly close to the mound, which means that it's probably sort of all part of the same religious kind of complex. And then this is sort of a map of what's in the shaft tomb. We've got tons of whole vessels here, strings of beads. The picture isn't great, but we've got all kinds of strings of beads, colored pigments, all types of shell artifacts that are placed in this tomb. So whoever's in the shaft tomb, and unfortunately we don't know because we don't have good preservation, is clearly getting a lot of grave goods, and they're probably someone who's important if they're making it into that sort of elaborate tomb. So we have all this information from 1941, but there's so much that we don't know because our notes are really not great. We don't have, the recording standards in 1941 are not quite up to par with what we use today. So we got a lot of questions that we wanted to find out about. We wanted to figure out, first of all, we didn't know exactly where the WPA excavated. So we know they excavated this mound. We don't know exactly where it was because they pretty much excavated most of it away. We didn't know how big the site was. So we know that there's this mound site. We have no idea how big it is, how many people live there. You know, is it just the mounds? Are there houses? You know, is just the mounds in those two houses, or are there more? We wanted to look and see what the construction sequence of the mounds are because we don't have a great, you know, the WPA sequence is not great. The other thing is, one of the things the WPA didn't look at was they didn't look at floral and faunal material. One of the things that we can do now is that we can dig up, you know, prehistoric remains, do what we call flotation, which could basically get all the charred seeds out, and then we can tell what people were eating. You know, were they eating just maize? Were they cultivating other things? And faunal material. What kind of animals were they using? Presumably they're mostly subsisting on white-tailed deer, but another thing that you find in southeast Oklahoma is that the prehistoric Caddo ate a lot of bear. So we wanted to see if there's a lot of black bear remains, which, you know, is sort of been found on other sites in the area. So we wanted to see if that's the same case here. So, and the other thing is we want carbon samples so we can get radiocarbon dates. It'll give us an idea of when this stuff dates to, because in the 1940s when the WPA excavated, they didn't have radiocarbon dating. So this is what the site looks like today, or what it looked like in 2008. I'm assuming it still looks the same. I haven't driven by there in about a year. There are two mounds, which they look more impressive in person than they do in the picture. So we've got what we call Mound A, which is the one the WPA excavated, and then Mound B. So we went out with the landowner one day, and you know, he pointed us out to us, and he told us that that we're lucky we came along because someone had, this sort of sits on the edge of a bluff, and so in the middle of the night someone had come in and dug a tunnel into this mound from the bluff, trying to get to the middle of it, and shored it up with, like, you know, 2x4s and plywood, and they had lights out there, they were digging at night, and so he took all their equipment, and they had left all their shovels, and so he took it, and he said they're welcome to come and get it from him, which of course never happened. And then we have what used to be Mound A. We know Mound A, even though the WPA excavated it, still used to be bigger, but unfortunately our landowner sort of leveled it out, because you know, the more level your field is, the better production you get. So I know that one of the old guys who lived in the site said it used to be big enough that you could hide a whole mule and a cart behind it, but now it's just down to like this sort of just very slight rise in the field. And it's just a hay field now, so it doesn't get plowed, which is good. It used to be cultivated, but now it's just hay. So our map of the site, just the picture I was taking was up by block. The picture I showed you was taken by block 1 facing into the field. And then sort of these are our sort of excavation blocks. I'm just going to talk about blocks 1, or 5, 2, and 1, because these two were not interesting. And then you can see Mound B, and here it is on the edge of this bluff, and you can see how it sits higher, and then sort of over this lower south field, and this is kind of where the looters had placed the tunnel and tried to tunnel into the site. I wish it would have collapsed on them. Oh well, no such luck. So one of the things that we can do now in archaeology that this is within the past decade is that we can use what we call a gradiometer and do what geophysical survey. So this is basically archaeology without having to dig. This gradiometer actually picks up changes in magnetic fields below the ground. So anytime anybody had a fire, it alters the magnetic field of or magnetic signature of the surrounding soil, and so this gradiometer is sensitive enough to pick that up. Other things it'll pick up is it will pick up, you know, midden soil. I was talking about those big accumulations of garbage. Because those attract a different kind of bacteria that have a different kind of iron content, you can actually pick up midden areas with this gradiometer. Mostly on sort of Caddo sites, it's more useful for finding burned areas, because Caddo frequently burn down houses, because what will happen is you build a house out of wood and straw and grass, it gets filled with vermin, it starts to rot, so periodically they'll just burn down the house and start over with a new house. So that's why this is a pretty effective. And they also burn down accidentally, because obviously you've got a house made out of all natural stuff and a fire in the middle. Occasionally bad things happen. So to find where we wanted to excavate, we did this through Gradiometer Survey over a lot of the field. This is pretty much what we had time to do. So I know this just looks like, you know, your TV just went out and it's just snow, but people who know what they're doing can actually look at this and pick out usually darker areas or concentrations of higher magnetic signatures. And so our geophysics expert, which is not me, identified this area, and what we're looking at here are elevation contour lines. And so we've got this area, and it also sits on like a little rise here, so that's got to be something. And then we knew we've got this big square pattern here that shows us where the WPA excavated, so we know where their units were now. We pretty much just knew we wanted to excavate in the mound, and then we actually found this area up north by coring. It was too deep for the magnetometer to detect. It only goes down to 2 meters. So yeah, Mound A, pretty cool because you can actually see the square the WPA excavated out. That's block 5, which is you see the big blobs of black and white. That's what it looks like when a building burns, and it sits on a little rise. So we knew that was good. And then block 1 is the one we had to find by coring because it was so deep. So this whole area, we did this sort of like T-shaped excavation. We dig these each of these are 2 by, so there's 2 2x2 meter units here, and then 4 across here. And we dig these in 10 centimeter levels so that we have good control. And what you can see, hopefully this picture shows, is that it starts off and it's really shallow, and then it goes and gets really deep over here. The other thing we can see is that the soil here looks kind of bumpy. It's very irregular. What was in this block is basically, you can see, I can't see it that well in this. There's a really nice color change here. So we've got this really light soil up at the top, and then it gets really, really dark, which is great. That's what we want to see as archaeologists, because that means there's all kinds of garbage and trash. And of course, we love the garbage pile. So this is a little bit better illustration of it. So what we have is, we have about 40 centimeters of just soil that's just washed down because there's bad erosion in this area, so it's deposited on top of it. But below that, we have this really nice dark soil you can see here in the profile, and it's just full of stuff, just full of pottery, full of lithic tools, and that's pretty much what it's full of because no bone preserved. But you know, we know that it's basically a giant garbage pit, and it's really irregular. So when we see these in archaeological record, what these are is there were people went in and they dug out existing clay to use to build the walls of their houses. So I showed you that photo where you've got the posts that are set far apart. What goes between those walls is a mixture of clay and grass that we call daub. You've got to get the clay from somewhere, so what they did was they basically dug out this big pit to extract the clay, and then it filled in with garbage, which is absolutely perfect for us because not only do we get garbage, we get a nice sort of sequence. So the older stuff, because they're throwing trash into it, it's sort of reversed. So or it's not reversed. The older stuff is down at the bottom, and then it's newer up to the top because obviously the older stuff is earlier. So we get a really nice sort of sequence of stuff, and we get tons of it that we can figure out how old is this. So this is just pottery from 1 10 centimeter level of 1 unit into this very dense midden. This is a lot of pottery to find, and a lot of it is decorated, which is nice because we can compare it to decorated pottery from other parts of the Caddoan area and tell how old it is. We've got a fair amount of this pottery that's got red slipping on it. We've got shell tempering, which we know means it dates to AD 1300 at least, and we've analyzed all this stuff, and we're still sort of in the process of comparing it to the WPA stuff. But what we figured out is that this sort of dump area where everybody's throwing all their garbage is pretty late, like 1300 plus. So we also put a unit on the top of the mound because we wanted to see the second mound that has not been excavated. So we wanted to see what the construction sequence looked like. One of the cool things is that we've got pictured here, this is a pile of ash with some burned clay next to it, so it's probably a hearth in the middle of the house. And then this is a sort of area, these houses would have packed clay floors. And the packed clay floors don't survive intact. You never dig a house and here's the whole floor. But you usually get just pieces of these that survive because of moisture and and various effects of the elements, they'll sort of only survive in patches. But we definitely have this nice portion of a patch clay floor here. So we know that this is a mound that had a house on top of it, at least at one point in the mound sequence. So that's a better close-up of it, just so you can see the area A. This is a big gray ash pile. And then around it is a burned soil, which probably means there's a hearth. And then this is your patch clay floor. And that's just sort of what's left of it. And it's pretty typical. They don't, like I said, you never get a whole clay floor that shows up. You just get pieces of them. And so this is what it actually looks like in the profile. So this is after we dug through it. There's the ash pile and the ash and then the edge of the hearth. And then we've got this pretty clear like mound extension here where it has like an angle. It's, you know, the exact right shape to the mound. It's got a nice angle, and then it goes to a flat top. So we did some radiocarbon dates, and I think the top part of the mound dates to about 1400. The lowest levels are pretty early, like 81,000. So this is a long-term use on this mound. And yeah, so that's sort of what the profile looks like. And you can see there's the hearth and the actual where they added mound construction on top of that. So the final sort of thing that we looked at Clement Site is we had that area I showed you where we found the magnetometer. And the weird thing about it is the reason why we found this in the magnetometer is that it's so shallow. You know, I showed you earlier we've got that bin, and it's, you know, this deep, 60 centimeters below the surface, and then we had people digging over here, and our field school students pretty much like stuck a shovel in the ground, and it was like, oh wait, there's burned daub, and there's burned charred roof timbers you can actually see. So this house was really super shallow. And I don't know if this is because, I suspect it's because our landowner had probably bulldozed across it at some point, and that's why it wasn't that deep. But we've got, you know, this whole series of burned clay. We've got all these charred timbers. So this is what it looks like when you come down on archaeologically on a house that's burned down. And there's really nothing else that looks like that. So we knew immediately we were in the right spot. So we actually have two overlapping houses in this area. This is what your square house looked like. I showed you in Long Hats. The Long Hats village from the 1870 photo. They're built with this series of posts around the edges. Then the daub is placed in between. We have 4 posts here. And then the roof is done with thatching. So there's like bundles of grass that are stuck in there. And this is why every few years you have to burn it down because it gets full of all kinds of bugs and it starts to rot. And this is actually at the Spiro site in eastern Oklahoma. You can actually see one of these. Only this picture is about 10 years ago, and now the roof is sort of rotting and it's falling in. You can see why you want to burn it down and start over again. So what we actually have, the main part of the house that we excavated is actually one of these round, sort of thatched beehive houses. So you see these round houses, they're built with poles that are flexible and they're tied at the top, and they don't have any daub on them, but they have just sort of grass around the whole thing. So that's what we have here, and you can see there's all sorts of burned soil here and then timbers. And the cool thing is we have enough roof timbers intact that we could use this foam insulation stuff that you usually use to hold the windows in your house, to fill cracks in the windows of your house. We can actually use that to extract these timbers whole, take them back to the lab, look at them under a microscope, and figure out what kind of wood they were using. So that's one thing that we still have yet to do because we have to actually cut them out of the foam, which is kind of annoying. But you know, it's really good preservation to have that much wood charcoal remaining. We got some great radiocarbon dates off of it. And the other thing is, once we dug down through just the burn mess, is we actually get the intact wall posts. So all of these dark stains that you see here with a little bit of sand on the outside are actually the posts that would have actually held up the house. So here they are here, and they're way deep. You have to dig really deep posts for these flex pole structures, because if you don't put them down way deep, the force of bending those poles in means they're going to shoot right out of the ground. So these are extremely deep posts, and they form this nice arc that tells us it's a round house. And then we can only see this in the profile, but we can actually see the floor of the house where everything burned and fell on top of it. So this thin layer here, unfortunately when we're digging down it, there's so much just burned junk that fell on the floor that you can't see it. You can only see it in the walls. But you have this nice light layer here, and all the burned stuff is sitting on top of it, and that's the actual floor. That would have been the floor of the house. You know, it's not so much packed clay as it is just you can see the level where all the stuff stopped falling, and that tells you, you know, if all of the charcoal is sitting on top of here, that's got to be the floor of the house. And then here's another illustration. One of the things that's crazy about this house when it burned, before it burned, it did not burn accidentally because they cleaned out everything. So we've got, there's the charcoal layer, and then you can see we've got this depression here and all this junk in it. That depression is actually a pit that would have been in the floor of the house that they actually, you know, usually these things are full of ash, they're full of some kind of garbage, they're full of, you know, artifacts of some sort. Note, when they burned this house down, they even cleared out the garbage pits that were inside the, or, you know, whatever these pits were inside the house, they cleared everything out of it, and so the house actually fell down into it. Unfortunately, we don't have much from the middle of the hearth because a gopher had dug through the entire thing. So there's a big gopher den that goes right in the middle of the house, and then it died in that hole right before we got out and excavated. So that one of the unpleasant things about archaeology. When it's 95 degrees outside, the last thing you want is a dead gopher in the middle of your units. So yeah, this is a sort of map of what the house will look like, and everything sort of here down is gopher destroyed, and its final resting place is somewhere out in here. And so we have a series of these round posts, and then there's a gap here. So unfortunately, we didn't extend our units here because we ran out of time, but we're pretty sure this is the entrance. The entrance with a face to the south. But we have this really nice post pattern. And then, as always happens when we're doing archaeology, so on the next to the last day, we found another house in this unit here. It's actually a rectangular house rather than a round house. So, and you know, this always happens. You're finishing up the site, you're trying to get everybody done, and then it's like, hey, I think I have another house over here. So hopefully we'll be able to go back and work on that in the future. We're still working on all the artifacts from this site, so we don't really, we're still working on all the artifacts. So what we know about Clement now is that we have a site, it's here, there aren't a lot of people that live there, so we've got this house that was burned, this round house that was burned and cleaned out completely. It's not full of living garbage. We have the two houses that look like they're special purpose houses from the Arkansas Valley, so they're not houses that people live in. And then we have the mounds. And then all the other sites that we know about are sort of away from Clement. So what we're sort of interpreting Clement as if you go back to that 1692 mound, Clement itself, the area that we worked in, is just that sort of mound portion. It's just the portion where the priest would have sort of lived and sort of overseen. So it's the very, and all of the Caddoan sites are located all upstream. So everybody, so this is sort of the, like on that terrain map, you've got the edge, and then you've got everybody living off to the side. I think that's what's going on at Clement, is that it's kind of the vacant mound precinct. Everybody comes downstream to have their ceremonies there, but they live upstream along the Glover. And then we've got Bourbon Davis, who's 6 kilometers away, and we don't have really any sites in between there. So that looks like what we've got at the Clement site. So we'll talk a little bit about Bourbon Davis as well. So Bourbon Davis is a little bit more elaborate than the Clement site. The site was actually in 1978, somebody pointed it out to one of the archaeologists who worked in the region, and they went to visit it, and they were shocked because it had never been looted. You know, Clement had been looted starting back in like 1900. Guys showed up from Paris, Texas, and dug out part of one of the mounds. They took a bunch of pots from there. But Clement, no one has really ever done a lot of digging there, so it's very intact. And so what it is this Bourbon Davis site here is there's a horseshoe-shaped terrace that's along the Little River, and there's a series of 7 mounds along this terrace. So what you're looking at here is a contour map with the 7 mounds. And they're all located sort of along the edge of this horseshoe. And the very middle of the horseshoe is low-lying and it's swampy, and there's all this water that stands up in there, so we know that it's not occupied. So in 1983, Don Wyckoff, who was our state archaeologist, went out and tested the site because no one had ever done the archaeology there, and he dug a whole series of post-hole tests in these sort of two transects and then on the mounds, and then dug 3 test units, just trying to figure out, what is this site? Is it what kind of mounds are these? When were they built? How old are they? Do people live at this site, or is it just mounds? What he found is that, and this is a density map, over here is pottery, and then over here we're looking at stone. Obviously there's stone distributed all the way around the horseshoe, and then the pottery seems to be really sort of concentrated up the top. The stone may be all the way around the horseshoe because I think there's probably an earlier occupation that dates before the Caddo, and anything that dates before Caddo pretty much is just lithics. They didn't make pottery. So you get a lot of stone and no pottery on sites in areas of the site where there weren't a lot of Caddo people living. But what we do see is there's definitely a concentration of pottery way up at the north edge of the site. And down here we've got mounds. And even out here between the mounds, there's not a lot of material. 0.251 sherds per post-hole test, not a lot. It's very, very, it's not like the Mid-Clement, it's very, very sparse density. So one of the unfortunate things is all the artifacts from the 1983 testing had to go back to the landowner. So we don't have them anymore, we just have pictures. But we can tell from this stuff up here, we have Sheltonburg pottery, so we know there's a 1350 occupation. We also have a bunch of earlier decorated stuff, and that dates to probably AD 1100 and to 1300. So we have 2 different sort of occupations of the site, 1100 to 1300 and 1300 to probably 1450, same time period that we have at Clement. So this is what the site looks like now on the aerial. This horseshoe is pretty clear even now. The trees are kind of growing together, so it's a little bit hard to see. But it's a hay field. It's owned by the Archaeological Conservancy, so it's preserved, and the guy who cuts the hay runs people off when they try to get out there. So in 2009, we went out there and just basically made a new and better map using our new and better technology. So again, this just shows you the 7 mounds of the site. It also shows you how much more the tree line has grown out since 1983. So we got a grant last year to do geophysics, so to do magnetometry work and try and figure out if people actually live at this site, or is it just a bunch of mounds? So we wanted to focus on areas between the mounds, as well as doing some work over the mounds. So we put a whole series. This is all of our geophysics grids that we did, looking at the magnetometer, trying to see what's below the surface. I'm just going to skip over this because you can't see the results from this really. So I'm going to go through sort of mound by mound and talk about sort of how these mounds were built. The biggest mound in the site here is Mound A. It's about 2 meters tall. It's been plowed down a little bit. There is a little looter pit in the summit. Somebody did come up and try and dig down into it, but it's not very deep. Measures 42 meters by 35 meters, so we're talking 100 feet by about 125 feet. So it's probably another one of those square pyramidal mounds. Don Wyckoff dug a unit into it here, off of the edge of the mound. He found 5 different layers of mound construction, 3 different layers of mound construction. Then they went to the top, and because we've got that big looter pit, they can just clean out the wall of that, and they found 5 more layers of mound construction, and they don't match up. So the bottom of the looter pit is a different layer of mound construction than this pit off the side. So we know that there's at least 8 different levels. This mound is constructed in 8 stages, possibly more, because since they don't match up, it's 9 plus. So we know that this is a long-term occupation here. So the really cool thing, and this is sort of made for people who do geophysics, but I can explain what's going on here. Ignore this line here, because what we have is anytime you see these black and white things, that's metal in the soil. Obviously, you're using a giant magnet. Anytime there's historic metal around, it goes crazy. So there's a fence here, so that screws up our data a little bit. And someone obviously threw a big piece of metal in the looter pit at the top. But the really cool thing about this is we have this square pattern of higher magnetics, which you can sort of see here, and I'll put something on it that shows it better, that outlines the entire mound. It looks better on the screen than it does on here. So there I just traced it out and shown the contours of the mound. You know, at first we didn't know what that was. Like, why is there a big perfect square or perfect rectangle that goes all the way around the mound? So we're a little bit confused. Then I started looking at the Caddo, for whatever reason, like to divide up their space. So they always built these like earthen little ridges around things. So all these sites in the Caddo area have these earthen ridges around them. There's all different kinds of them. There's earthen ridges around big burial pits. So they would build these berms around, around the bottom of a shaft. And then there's just these earthen ridges that are defined around roundhouses. And then, at sites, which isn't even on here, like Crenshaw, there's just the big earthen ridge that runs between two mounds. So what we think it is that it's below the mound we have some sort of what we call a berm that delineates the space in the mound. And it turns out, I was just talking to some people from Arkansas like a couple weeks ago, and they've got a site way up at the sort of top of the map where they have the same pattern. They've got these big berms separating out space in the mound. So that's something that's not been excavated. No one's ever excavated one of these big mound-sized berms, so we need to do that. Mound B is the second largest mound at the site. We think it's a two-stage mound, so there's two different summits, 2.1 and 1.9 meters high. And we found the same thing in Mound B. Unfortunately, half of Mound B is covered in trees, so you can't do this work with the trees. But we have the same sort of big square pattern showing up there. So it looks like we have two mounds that have these big, earthen berms within them, at least at the site, probably more. Mound C is one of the smaller mounds. It's probably a burial mound, so we'll never excavate that. But we do have the results that show these sort of pits with higher magnet. It may actually be burial pits, so that's one of those things we won't ever work in that mound. Mound D is another one of the smaller mounds. We don't have great results from it. Now, the only part of the site where we really have a lot of what looks like houses are in this area. We have this small rise that we call Mound E, and the mag data is hard to read, but we have what looks like the patterns that are consistent with at least, I have 7 houses shown here, there may be more. We definitely have a big house under Mound E, and then we've got all these sort of square areas of higher magnetism, and that is what a burned house looks like in the sort of data. So we know we have 7 burned houses up here at the northern part of the site. And we definitely have a burned house under here. We know at a site in Arkansas, they excavated one of these mounds next to a mound that looks just like Mound B, and they interpret it as a cookhouse. The whole house was full of ash and parts of giant pots where it looks like they were cooking food for the people who lived on the mounds. So Mound F, which is on the other side of the site, again we have more berms, and the same thing at Mound G. So just to kind of give you a little bit of idea of this site, we have berms in 2, maybe 4 of the mounds. We have Mound E that's over a burned building. The thing that we found out was that all these areas that are open that have number 3s on them, nobody lives there. So no one lives at this site, except for 6 houses up at the northern part, which, when you think about it, 6 houses is not going to hold a lot of people, and we don't even know the sort of time on those, but clearly there's not a lot of people who, if anybody lives at this site, it's 2 or 3 people probably. So that's the only area where we have people living. The woods keep encroaching on the site. So what we've sort of figured out, let me just go back a few slides here, what we sort of figured out about Bourbon Davis is that we have another one of these sites that's very similar. We have another one of these sites that's very similar to the Clement site. So we have, Clement is this mound site that's on the edge of this cluster of Caddoan sites. And then it looks like Bourbon Davis is another vacant site that's sort of situated on the edge, and there's a whole different cluster of sites here. So our big interpretation now is that we have two religious centers that are occupied at the same time, and they're very close to one another, but they're probably serving two different groups of people. So, everybody who's living this way in the Little River and probably down here below the confluence of the Glover is using the Bourbon Davis site, but they're not living there. And then everybody who lives up the Glover drainage and sort of on those terraces is using the Clement site. And clearly they're not people who are fighting with one another because they're not living in these sites where they're palisaded. But it does look like we have sort of two separate groups of people that are living there. And that's one of the things that we need to do is excavate at Bourbon Davis and see how similar their architecture and artifacts are to Clement, because we don't know. And that's sort of where we stand in Southeast Oklahoma. So if anybody has any questions?
Okay, I'll ask a couple then.
Yeah.
Now in Cahokia, you had mainly two different mounds. One were living mounds that were kind of flatter on top, and ones were burial mounds that were more conical. Yeah. Do you see that same architecture in these mound sites?
Yeah, the Caddo had these sort of pyramidal mounds, the pyramids where you've got the house on top. Well, there's sort of two types. And so you've got the burial mounds, and then the Caddo also built these tiny house mounds where it's just like one house and then a little mound over it, and that's the whole thing. And so, so they're a little bit different in that respect because we have all these little tiny mounds. But it's pretty similar to the Cahokia model where you've got the pyramidal mound. The difference, though, is I think that whatever mounds you've got at the Caddo are using them differently. They're more of a religious center, whereas at Cahokia they're more like the center of political life. So the chief, who's also sort of the religious leader, is using those to exert control, whereas I think with the Caddo it's more religious than political.
Okay, and then on Mound A of the first site, there was a shaft that they used as a burial shaft. Would that show up on your I guess magnetics?
Yeah, because it unfortunately, it's the one where the EPA dug it out, but it should show up because anytime you get earth that's moved, you get a lower magnetic signature because it's not compacted as much once it's refilled. So it shows up. It should show up presumably if you go over it. And I've never seen the shaft tune as you've got the whole mound and the shaft tune is like a big light-colored stain in the middle of it where there's less mag because they've disturbed all that soil.
That was, I guess, my follow-up was, did you see anything like that in Mound B when you did it?
No, unfortunately we didn't, but I don't think Mound B has a shaft tune in it. I think it's just a platform mound with people living on top of it. So I think even if we did have this weird sort of thing that looked like I don't think I have it zoomed in, but the problem is the mag only goes down like, maximum 2 meters, but then you've got to realize also that you're holding it, so really you only get 1.5 meters. And the problem is if the mound is deeper than 1.5 meters, you're not going to get, you're not going to get any results. But we have this weird thing that looks like a spaceship on that mound, and I'll go back to it here. It's weird. It also looks like a longhorn, so there were a lot of jokes made about that. But yeah, you can sort of see it. Like, right. So this is over the mound. But we've got this thing, and it actually looks like a Longhorn logo, which of course made everybody at OU sick. But so we've got that and this, and and I don't know what kind of goes in it. And the problem is when you get like a mound where it's like layers upon layers of stuff, it gets real hard to interpret them. So like those mounds that we did, we can see like at Bourbon Davis, we can see what's at the edges, but in the middle it gets hard to interpret. So.
Do you run across hematite artifacts, and does that throw your magnetics off?
Yes and yes. So what you're seeing here is mostly just farm debris. And the other thing is there's a house, well, it's not on here, but like right out in here, there's like an old broken down house. So anytime like you get anybody who lives somewhere historically, garbage just gets everywhere. So the metal just makes it, just messes everything up. So when you have the metal in the soil, the metal in the soil will black out, this might be like a nail, and it's blacking out 2 meters all the way around. So, of course, there's nowhere on Earth that doesn't have metal, just historic garbage in the soil, but, it gets frustrating. You get a lot of this.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, let's give a round of applause